Hello all and welcome back to Shatter Our Souls with Novaria. And I gotta say, it is great to be back behind the visor. So, a while back, I did a run through the entirety of the Metroid Prime trilogy and figured let's see how that all goes out. Let's see what we can actually make of it. And I learned a lot about the games in terms of their difficulty and spoke a lot to how the games themselves exist within the greater gaming and greater Metroid franchise. Today, I want to start looking at the sequel, the long-awaited 8-year gap, I suppose, in the form of Metroid Prime 4. Now, right off the hop, I am going to say that this game is going to have some mixed statements. It's not that there's anything wrong with the game per se, just that anything that I truly enjoy is not necessarily above critique. So understand prior to that, I suppose, that there is more to it than just me stating one way or the other what is or isn't up to par. Now, I suppose the first question I wanted to ask is whether or not this game is actually Metroid. And there are technically two main discussions to have here. The first is either the game is absolutely Metroid because it shares the name and it plays like Metroid Prime 3, more specifically, or it is absolutely not Metroid and you're going to point at Super Metroid and say it has nothing to do with this. Whichever version that you particularly would like to follow, I can't fault you. There is a certain difference between games over time, especially over the years that the Metroid franchise has been around, that really showcase just how far this franchise has come, but also why I think this game falls flat in a couple areas. And so, to start off, I suppose I need to do a little bit of historic stuff. Now, the Metroid franchise started up in the 80s originally. And the original game's entire premise was effectively that you could go wherever you wanted, that it had lock and key style puzzles, where certain abilities would lock out certain regions, be it too hard or perhaps difficult to traverse regions. Whatever it was lock and key. You needed the key to break the lock and move further on into the game. Your progression was intended to be non-linear. This came in the form of side upgrades like energy tanks, missile upgrades, etc., but it also came in the form of mapping and understanding your worlds. Now, without getting too far into it, the second game in the franchise came and went, and it did much the same thing, but it had a slightly more linear approach. The entire game was built from the ground up with the same mentality as the first game, but due to the nature of moving it from a console to a handheld, they focused more on short burst, get to a section, beat a couple enemies type of gameplay. The third game is Super Metroid. And this is where we really dive into why I think a lot of people are disappointed with Prime 4. And it is the fact that Metroidvanias were created, well, rather the genre was coined after the success of Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Both of these games intended to follow the steps of the originals. Non-linear game design, wide open spaces focusing on discovery. You had a world designed from the ground up with the intent for future growth, future understanding, but we're also not holding your hand. You were free to make mistakes. You were free to fall flat, and that was okay. That was part of the charm of the Super Metroid game. But along with that, I know at least from my own experience, I got incredibly lost in that game. I ended up going from one room to the next and never really found... I found that it was difficult to really get my bearings in it. And maybe that was just me, as there were other games that I had played around that era that I didn't have this issue with, and there were other games around that era that I struggled more with. Whichever side of the coin you fell on, it was a fantastic game. But how do you improve upon what many perceived to be perfection? Well, there were two routes. The first was Metroid Fusion, which focused more heavily on the storytelling aspects and creating a Metroid that focused more on storytelling, around backstory, around building up this character and the world, but also evolving the threat of the game beyond the basics. Now, the reason I want to point this out is because that was the outlier. The other way was to change the core principle of what the game was, from a 2D side-scrolling shooting action adventure game built around this lock and key system to the first-person shooter lock and key style first-person adventure of the Prime trilogy, or the Metroid Prime. And Metroid Prime took a lot of the same notes as Super Metroid had. In fact, if you went and you started the game, it was pretty well beat for the first 20 minutes how the original Metroid Prime and Super Metroid existed. I think that's kind of an interesting point. By the time we get to Prime 4, we now have an additional 3 Prime games in Metroid Prime Hunters, Metroid Prime 2, and Prime 3, but you also have Metroid Prime Federation Force, you have Metroid Fusion, a remake of the first Metroid, a remake of the second, and now even Metroid Dread. And so, the two series, if you were to call them such, diverged in 2001. One focusing on the first-person aspect, the other focusing on the third person. And truth be told, I don't really mind them. Both versions of the game have their merits. I would be amiss to say that I've played much more of Prime 4 than I ever did of Dread, but I also acknowledge that Metroid Dread is one of the best games in the Metroidvania genre that have come out in recent years. So, to iterate my point here, I do not believe that Metroid Prime 4 follows the core design philosophies of the Metroidvania genre. And this is why it is not necessarily considered Metroid. Now, truth be told, genre is something that is really hard to get around at times. Some games thrive on a specific genre. But the thing is that when your franchise has coined a genre, it becomes very difficult to break away from that. And so the first-person adventure Prime games have always felt a little bit off compared to their predecessors. Now, being a little bit semantic here and poking at things that maybe don't need to be poked at, I want to mention that Metroid Prime, when you first get onto the main planet of Talon 4, you end up with a choice. You can head up towards the cliffs, towards the seal over the big bad of the, like the Phazon Mines. You can also head towards the Chozo Ruins. You can technically head towards the riverfront, towards the crash site of the frigate Orpheon. Or if you're feeling extra spicy, you might even be able to find your way over to where a secondary escape room is, and you can make your way all the way to Magmore Caverns. This interconnected world, shall we say, was part and parcel of what made Metroid Prime so unique. As I've mentioned, it focuses very heavily on a similar design philosophies to Super Metroid. But where Super Metroid focused on making the experience replayable, focusing on giving extra abilities over time, or allowing sequence breaks, Metroid Prime often didn't. There was a certain level of linearity to the game that was different or changed how the narrative was approached. And maybe that's part of the plan. I don't necessarily know for certain. What I can say, for beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that Prime 4's storyline design philosophy falls more in line with Prime. But the Prime philosophy even evolved over time from there. And you can see it begin as soon as Metroid Prime 2, where each region you go to, you more or less have to finish before you reach the next region. And then Prime 3 took that and absolutely ran with it. Now, put simply, I believe that Metroid Prime 4 doesn't necessarily break the conventions of the Prime series. Rather, it leans more heavily into them. Now, with heavy spoilers in mind here, I want to take a look at how the game functions, and then kind of point that back to other games for a moment. Now, in Metroid Prime 4, your focus is building up new gear, new weapons. It has a focus on what we'll call psychic weaponry, which is a new set of abilities tied to a now extinct race, the Lemur. Now, in and of itself, I don't mind with this particular side. I think providing a new set of abilities for Samus is probably and will forever be the right call. But they deviate just enough for it to seem unique, while also using only abilities that have shown up in some capacity, excluding one of them, in prior games. And while we're here, we also get to meet the main antagonist, Sylix. Now, Sylix as a character as well is something I will be getting to later. For now, I just want to explain how this functions. When you enter the world of Vuros, you end up in a circumstance where you are marooned, shipwrecked, Metroid Prime 2 style. In this case, your ship is nowhere to be found. You have no means of getting home outside of a minor solution, which is, barring anything else, the ability to use a teleporter that requires psychic energy to operate. Cool! We have tied in psychic energy to the main plot. The second bit is that each region must be completed more or less in full prior to gaining access to the next. Now, once again, this is part of that lock and key style system that Metroid has become known for. But I also feel that in this particular sense, the lock and key system doesn't really do as much as it used to. Now, remember how I went back and mentioned Metroid Prime and how you could theoretically go all over the place? Well, I kind of lied. See, the first room has 3 doors. The door on top by the waterfall leads you toward the ruins above the Phazon Mines. but that's blocked by a missile door, so you can't go there. The way towards the frigate Orpheon's crash site is blocked by a impassable wall that has a small hole in it for the morph ball that you also can't access. But wait, there's more. The ability to go towards the Magmor Caverns is blocked off by another missile door, so that's now twice you're blocked by that, leaving the only option to be towards Talon Overworlds or Chozo Ruins. So once again, it's much more linear, but it gives the illusion, at the very least, of non-linearity. It is only after you've gained the first 3-4 items that you really gain any sense of freedom. That being the Charge Beam, the Morph Ball bombs, and missiles. And if you really want to get semantic in there, you have to also beat the boss of the Chozo Ruins region, Flagra, before you really get a good grasp of where you can potentially go at that time. Metroid Prime 4 tries to emulate this to a degree. Upon entering Vuros, we have access to a few basic abilities. We have our standard single jump, we have our standard power beam, the scan visor, that currently is inoperable because there's no data on it, as well as we have access to the charge beam. That's it. Oh, and the morph ball. We do in fact have the morph ball. But beyond that, beyond the absolute basics, the core, Samus really is walking into this mission with next to nothing. Now, in and of itself, that's not a problem. You've seen it in every Metroid game going forward. Every Metroid game for the past, I suppose it's been 20 years. Almost 40 if we really want to get semantic about it. But we have seen it every single game since the original, with the only outlier being the one we don't mention. So in that regard, I can't say that I'm disappointed in how this goes. But where Metroid Prime focused on the illusion of being able to get somewhere, a idea of you can go anywhere as long as you think about it or plan ahead, Metroid Prime 4 doesn't have that. When you enter the, I suppose, first main area of the game, the Fury Green, you are met with a straight line, which is great for action sequences. Metroid Fusion proved that with having a much more streamlined version of a Metroid game. Metroid Prime 4 leans into a more streamlined style of gameplay. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Instead, I want to say that it leaning into this is potentially its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. See, when you focus on a game that is more story and oriented, you can end up getting to a point where the world itself needs to tell a story. And in that regard, Metroid Prime 4 does. But I often felt that I was searching for something that wasn't there. In Metroid Prime 2, you could see bits and pieces of the world telling the story for you. You could see cracks and hollows. You could see destroyed bits of architecture. You had a translator of the Luminoth language to try to gain a better understanding of what happened in each region. You had creatures that were already hostile to you being even more so, or having certain degrees of evolution on their side. And I didn't really see a whole lot of that in Prime 4. Instead, Prime 4 focused more heavily on what I would consider to be the planetary problem. Now, every Metroid has a planetary problem of some variety. I'm not going to say they don't. Metroid 1 had the problem of the Metroids being introduced to a planet they were never intended to be on. Metroid 2 focused in on the story and evolution of the Metroids on SR388. Super focused on Zebes and its issue with the space pirates having retaken over the planet. Metroid 4, also known as Metroid Fusion, focused more on the evolution and change in the planet of SR388 after the decline of the Metroids. Dread focused very heavily on that same basic idea or topic, but applied it to another planet altogether, and splicing in a little bit of the story of the Chozo. But Prime 4 is so removed from so much of the core of the world building that has happened over the last 40 years in the core series that it becomes a question of how much can we actually use. Metroid Prime 1 had the issue of Talon 4 being under, shall we say, the illness or decay caused by Phazon. Prime 2 had a similar source of their problem, but an entirely different concern in the terms of a war between the Luminoth and the Ing, creatures of light and dark. Prime 3 introduced us to 4 planets, 5 if we count Phase. One was suffering from, or one, we stopped a meteor from hitting the planet and destroying the entirety of it. The second had a war between those that were knowledgeable and those that weren't. As I was saying, the planet Brio focused in on a war between those that had knowledge or information, the science, and the, shall we call it, the more primitive or more spiritual side of their, I suppose, colonies or worldview. You had Elysia that existed as a viewpost out into the cosmos for the Chozo that witnessed the creation of Phase as well as potentially was the source of a solution against Phazon. And you had the Pirate Homeworld, which showcased exactly what Phazon can do if left unchecked. Now, Vuros follows suit with that. It is a planet that has always been harsh. Unlike other planets that we have seen throughout the entire franchise, Vuros is harsh, deserted, and, dare I say, even more dangerous than your average world, which is kind of saying something. It doesn't necessarily support large life in the way that other planets have. But that's not necessarily to its detriment. Fury Green, for example, is a verdant paradise with a tree that holds psychic energy and, dare I say, the memories of the entire species of Lemorn from the moment of their ability to gain psychic power all the way to, effectively, their end. The Lemorn are kind of an interesting species to me. There's absolutely next to nothing said about them. There is very limited information on their culture, their world as a whole. Only that when they went through like 3 to 4 phases in their entire species timeline. There was the early days, there was the technology age, or the psychic age, the technology age, and the decline, is pretty much how it boils down. And you, more or less, over the course of the game, are shown each section of their worldview in the order it happened. And so, this, more than any other, actually has you walking in the steps of the other species that you have witnessed. Unlike Prime 1, where you were experiencing something that happened 50 years ago and are simply reading about it from lost diary entries, Prime 4 focuses very heavily on building up the world through having you experience it. Now, this approach is actually in very, very stark contrast to Primes 1 and 2. In fact, very, very significant contrast to Prime 3 as well. Its world is divorced from what came before. And I want to be very conscientious of that. When Retro finished the Prime trilogy, they flat out said that this is the end of this storyline. Maybe not the end of Metroid, but the end of the Phazon saga, at least for now. Now, what I liked about that is that it came to a clean ending. Samus herself had solved everything that needed to be solved with Phazon that she could actually help with. She destroyed the Phazon seed on Talon 4. She obliterated the Dark Aether. She cleared out the entire planet of Phase and destroyed every one of the Phazon seeds on 3 to 4 other planets. It's not that Samus had anything more to do, it is simply that what story there was to tell is done. And I think this is another kind of sticking point for people. Because Metroid Prime 4 is so far divorced from any prior statements that come about from the rest of the franchise, any other world building, any other characters, you end up with this sense of it being a somewhat, dare I say, generic shooter if you're not looking beyond the bare minimum. And to me, that's a bit of a shame. There was always something special about Prime 4 when playing it, the Prime series when playing it, that doesn't always translate well into Prime 4. And that is my personal disappointment with it. But the biggest question mark for me had to do with its exploration. See, I acknowledge that Prime 4 has exploration elements involved. You do have to go off the beaten path for a few things. But most of your going off the beaten path is using a tool in a way that it either was never intended to be used, or is kind of just experiencing the world through the eyes of a character that didn't really change much. Unlike other Metroids, I've found that Prime 4 doesn't really solve anything. And maybe that's intentional. I like to think that Metroid Prime 4 is the start of another saga. A further reach into the universe of Metroid. But I can't say for certain at this time. I believe that Metroid Prime 4 has the makings to build up another series, another saga. But I don't necessarily know where that would be or what that would look like as of yet. Now, is Metroid Prime 4 Metroid? Yes, I do believe it is. But, as I've mentioned, there were two approaches to it. The 2D and the 3D Metroid, the Prime and the Classic series. And the Classic series focuses in on that Metroidvania style of gameplay. But Prime 4 focuses more on a style of gameplay similar to Prime 3. The worlds themselves are open. You're allowed to go from one zone to the last. But it is more linear in that you're not going to be jumping miles ahead of where the game intends you to be at any point in time. Now, on a simplistic basis, this is actually a okay thing for me. I, admittedly, until I played the game 3-ish times over, hadn't even noticed. But the big issue I'm running into with that is its general linearity does tend to come at a cost of sorts. See, Prime 3, when it built the linear worlds, the 5 planets you were on, each planet had their own story, their own lore, their own something. Be it their own architecture. And every single one of them did something unique with it. Each planet fit within the world of Metroid, but never felt too far one way or the other. Each planet made me want more. I wanted to know more about Brio and Elysia. Man, did I want to know more about the planet Elysia. But the point is as you played the game, you learned more about your planet you were on. And it allowed you every step of the way to learn, to grow, to understand. And I feel like they were aiming for something similar to Metroid Prime 3, in that the game's design, at least its core philosophy, was meant to be linear but focused. That every time you picked up a controller, you had the possibility of coming across something more. And I love that idea. I love the idea of being able to experience this world in a different lens. But my biggest... Once again, we're going flip-floppy here. I love it. There's question marks. My big kind of concern with this design philosophy is that when it was done with Prime 3, you had 5 planets worth of information to go through. And so every time you turned a corner, every new data log showed something. Some new piece of information, something that just tweaks the narrative a little bit. But Prime 4, its narrative is pretty clear right from the get-go. The planet itself is in decay, it's in disarray. Why? You don't necessarily know, at least not at this point. And so, you know that the Lemorn are gone, that you are the last hope for the Lemorn as a whole. But what that looks like, what their hope actually is somewhat questionable. Your goal is to preserve their legacy, but not their species. See, this is something that I find rather interesting as a approach to this game. Other games focused in on preserving the planet in the form of Prime 1, preserving the species in Prime 2. But Prime 4, preserving the legacy, the memories, the history of the Lemorn, it hits a little different. It's a species that realized too late that they messed up. A species that hadn't accounted for potential consequences. A species that wanted, more than anything, to bring peace to their planet. And I do think that that was a good thing. It was something that should have been better conveyed. Aw, such a cute little... Never mind. That pill bug is gone. But that species, that world, it wants more. I want more. See, when you're walking through the realm of Fury Green, you have a series of little totems sitting upright that are intended to showcase, oh yeah, this is our temples, we know all about this area, this is what we want to showcase. Every new Lemorn that passes through this area on something like a pilgrimage would have a level of being awestruck by the great tree of life, effectively. And that, to me, is important. It sets up so much. And it didn't stick the landing. So, in my mind, I believe that this was intended, barring everything else, to be an evolution. An evolution of the Metroid Prime formula that, unfortunately, I do see landing questionably at times. See, Metroid Prime and Prime 2 were better received than 3. But I believe that Metroid Prime 1 and 2 were intended for a different generation. Now, this was a hard one. I'm going to age myself a little bit here. I was born just after after Super Metroid was released. As a result of that, I loved games that were a little bit more cryptic. A little bit, you were allowed to get lost and pick up a game later saying, I'll figure it out another time. But in our age of gaming, especially now, we are constantly being bombarded with new games, new features, new this, new that, games as a service, games as a everything. And so we end up in the situation where the time we are willing to invest in a game has dwindled exponentially. At least the next generation. So, in my mind, this is an evolution of Metroid. One that I do feel at times is a little bit of a step backwards. But at least it was an attempt. It was an attempt to bring Metroid Prime specifically, to a new generation. And no matter what I or anybody else thinks of it, if you enjoy it, play it. That's the beautiful thing about games. Every game has the proper gamer, if we will. Every game could be someone's favorite. Metroid Prime 4 is by far and away one of my favorite games to come out of the last 10 years. And that's really saying something because there's been a lot of games over the last 10 years. And reality is, Metroid Prime 4 did a lot that didn't land ideally. Note, ideally. But Metroid Prime 4 also did so much for building up the genre, for bringing it to the next generation, for showcasing a version of this game that we can all get behind. It is Metroid made to be ready for this next leap in technology. Metroid Prime 3 did a lot that was good at the time, but its greatest fault, its greatest flaw was a lack of precision. It was a lack of being able to let the player exist in that world. And the more I look at it, the more I realize that it might not have been the fault of Prime 3 per se, but a change in how we as gamers approach games. Now, oh geez, these grievers are annoying. We as gamers approach games in a way that is unique. Everybody has their own games that they like or dislike, and I don't want to be the guy who says don't play game because this. Rather, I want to say play the game if you think you'll enjoy it. And if you don't, I apologize. Prime 4's approach was more linear, more focused, more fast-paced. In an age where gamers have more to choose from than ever, building a game designed from the ground up with the player's time in mind, to me, is not a bad thing. It is just a different approach. Would I like to see more Metroid Prime built like Metroid Prime? Absolutely. But I'm also not going to say that Metroid Prime did everything right. The notable endgame MacGuffin hunt was one such area that gets a lot of flack. But the thing is that every game has their moments, their flaws. I could think like every game has them. The question isn't if, but what. So, good with the bad, I think Prime 4 made the right call. And I understand that it's not always going to be designed for me. But I can tell you with certainty that games designed for me wouldn't land in today's market. Not the way they did 20 years ago. So, I can understand it. Now, I suppose it's time to explore a different facet of the game. Something that most people would probably say is 50-50 for them. The side characters. Now, this is something that was brought up in Metroid Prime 3 as being a huge part and a huge flaw in the game. Now, Metroid Prime 3 focused on bounty hunters. Individuals that were of extremely high strength, extremely high capabilities, on par with or similar to Samus. I'm going to go with similar to Samus. And each of the three other hunters were intended to showcase a different mentality of sorts on how the world exists, how the systems within exist. But a group we've seen relatively little of is the Federation themselves. Now, To be clear, we've seen bits and pieces. We have individuals like Admiral Dane that have shown up. We have Adam Malkovich who showed up in Fusion. I'm not going to say that we haven't seen it. Only that what we have received is sparse at best. Metroid Prime 4 seeks to remedy that, with what I would consider to be much more tasteful versions of the Federation than what we received in prior games. Starting with Specialist Mackenzie. Now, Specialist Mackenzie is kind of the hand-holding mechanism of this game. Mackenzie has no interest of staying on Lamorne. No interest of staying on Vuros, sorry. And so, his goal is to get the heck off this planet as quickly as possible because anything that flies, crawls, and squats in the mud wants to kill you. I get that. I'm not saying that Mackenzie is wrong for having that intention and that belief. I am, however, going to say that Mackenzie comes off as very Navi-esque at times. The clouds on Death Mountain look funny. And that does occasionally lead to some frustrations. Some just let me play the game, let me explore, does tend to happen as a result of Mackenzie. But his whole everything, we are talking about a guy that was uprooted from his, dare I say, comfy desk job or a office job 9 to 5 into full-scale warfare with an alien race. He's not exactly comfortable with the current circumstances. Speaking with uncomfortable with the current circumstances, I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break here, so I will catch you all next Monday for episode 2 of the Metroid Mondays on Metroid Prime 4. If you like what you see, I would love if you left a like, a subscribe, or a comment down below. That would greatly, greatly be appreciated. Until next time, I hope you all have a good one.
This technology, it's not as old as the rest of these ruins. What do you think it's doing here?